Welcome to the Fixing Your City podcast. Here's George Crandall.
Chapter 5, Implementation Rules. Without implementation rules, a framework plan will be ineffective. Astoria is a historic Oregon fishing community at the mouth of the Columbia River. The town is filled with Victorian homes, and the river's edge is lined with remnants of the canneries that once processed the bountiful salmon harvest. My firm had been retained to prepare a master plan for the reuse of a large vacant industrial site in the downtown. During the planning process, the public expressed its concern about the changing character of their downtown. The statement we heard again and again was, "Our city is starting to look like every other city. We need to do something to protect our unique character." Our first step was to identify the design vocabulary that made Astoria unique. A unifying architectural feature was the dark gray roofs found on both homes and canneries. It was obvious that contemporary buildings with their multicolored metal roofs, reds, blues, greens, and yellows, were seriously eroding the town's character. There were no design guidelines in place in Astoria, and it was clear they were needed. We made our final presentation for master plan approval to the City Council. I hadn't expected much of a turnout because the council chamber was small and a winter storm was dumping rain on Astoria. I was surprised to see people arriving early to get a seat. By the time the meeting started, it was standing room only. I concluded my presentation with the comment, "Your next step should be to prepare design guidelines and initiate a design review process." The mayor, who was a local businessman, blurted out, "Over my dead body." The shocked audience sat in silence, and then someone yelled out, "Everyone in favor of design guidelines and design review, raise your hands." Every hand in the audience shot up. Some raised 2 hands. The mayor's reaction was not unusual. Businessmen and developers often consider design review a time-consuming and costly inconvenience. Architects often see it as an unwelcome interference into their world of design expertise. If the public could be assured that developers and architects would be responsive to the larger community context, then design review would not be necessary. The reality is that developers and architects have their own goals and cannot be relied on to determine what is most appropriate for a city. Astoria now has design guidelines and a design review process in place. New buildings are compatible with historic structures, and the special ambiance of Astoria is being preserved. The need for rules. Implementation rules provide the guidelines and standards needed to ensure that the intent of a framework plan is achieved. They tend to be the missing component in many planning efforts, yet they are an essential requirement if a transformation strategy is to be successful. Implementation rules include design guidelines, design standards, and public area standards. Design guidelines protect investment and ensure quality. Design standards identify essential requirements for private development. Public area standards specify streetscape and open space standards and details. Like a house, the 3 basic elements of a transformation strategy provide a foundation, an enclosure, and a roof. The implementation rules are the roof, a necessary component that protects the integrity of the completed framework plan once it has been developed. In the absence of a framework plan, some communities rely on rules and codes alone. Although this is another way to address transformation issues, the rules tend to be abstract, arbitrary, and ineffective because a detailed framework plan does not inform them. Implementation rules have a number of benefits. They put into place measures that enhance the downtown's appearance and livability. More importantly, they create economic vitality by attracting investors looking for opportunities in which the rules are clearly defined and risk is minimized. Implementation rules at their best prevent undesirable change and encourage desirable change. Undesirable change can include buildings that are incompatible in design, scale, or character with downtown neighborhoods, or perhaps roadway improvements that create a hostile pedestrian environment. Cities can be categorized into 3 types. Dynamic cities. The public likes to visit dynamic cities. Buildings and streets are designed to enhance the pedestrian experience. Building facade and scale are compatible with adjacent buildings and the surrounding neighborhood. Parking structures are attractive with cars hidden from view. Blank walls at the street level are avoided or absent altogether. A large population lives in a central core and has convenient access to employment opportunities, a vibrant retail environment, restaurants, and entertainment. There are plentiful quality of life features such as parks, open space, cultural facilities, and recreational opportunities. A dynamic city feels safe at all hours of the day and night and is a great place to live, do business, and visit. Dynamic cities do not happen by chance. They are a result of an effective framework plan and implementation rules. Ordinary cities. Cities that have few or no distinguishing features or places of beauty are not attractive to visitors. They may be old cities or newer suburban cities. They are automobile dominated and pedestrian hostile. An old city may once have been considered dynamic, but through the years it may have been degraded. One-of-a-kind historic buildings may have been demolished to make way for parking lots and indistinguished new buildings. Roadways were widened to accommodate automobiles and the pedestrian environment was compromised. Employment opportunities declined as employers left the core area, and sooner or later downtown retail shops moved out to the mall. Ordinary cities can become dynamic cities with an effective framework plan and implementation rules. And finally, terminal cities. The public and investors may choose not to visit or do business in a terminal city. Development in the central city core creates a hostile pedestrian environment. New office buildings with blank walls, parking structures with an active ground floor, and mini plazas line the street. Downtown shopping opportunities are limited and downtown housing is scarce. Large roadways and freeways dominate the use of land. Public transit is limited. After workers leave, the downtown is empty. Cities risk becoming terminal when the let the market decide philosophy is allowed to shape the urban environment. Unlike ordinary cities, terminal cities are difficult to repair. The substantial investment in pedestrian hostile buildings and large roadways are difficult to change and will be in place for generations to come. Terminal cities can be somewhat improved with a transformation strategy. Preventing city degradation. Implementation rules prevent developers, architects, transportation engineers, and others from degrading a city. A developer's primary motive is profit. If the community's values regarding the relationship of a building to the street are not well defined, it is likely that those concerns will not be part of the developer's priority. If the defining approach is let the market decide, the city has a surefire recipe for creating a pedestrian hostile environment. An architect's primary motive is to design and get paid for a building that the client can afford to build. The compatibility of the architectural design with adjacent buildings or the building's relationship to the street may not be a top concern. Far too many architects, driven by ego, instinctively want to create a special, one-of-a-kind design statement that stands out and brings praise. Perhaps the architects will receive an award if the design is truly unique. This will bring business to the architectural firm. The community's values risk being ignored unless design guidelines and standards are in place. The transportation engineer's primary motive is to move traffic. Increased traffic volumes will quickly make street pedestrian hostile, an unfortunate consequence of growth. Attention to the pedestrian and the bicycle riders is generally a lesser priority. When congestion begins to choke the roadways, motorists and politicians want an immediate fix, and the transportation engineer will be the first to hear about it. In the absence of public area standards, downtown streets will inevitably become pedestrian hostile over time. Implementation rules are the sole means for making sure the developer, the architect, and the transportation engineer all comply with community values. Without rules in place, cities risk becoming ordinary or terminal. The case for beauty. There are many ways to measure attributes of a city. For example, they are quantifiable standards for livability, education, walkability, transit service, employment, and safety. But a city's beauty is measured in more subtle ways. People are more inclined to value and visit places of beauty. Consider Santa Fe, Santa Barbara, Barcelona. It behooves decision makers to recognize that the effort to create beauty in a city is not frivolous. It is good business as well as pleasure. In an effort to define beauty, it may be helpful to identify the kinds of buildings that detract from a city's attractiveness. They include bunker buildings, or buildings with blank walls at the ground floor, modern buildings inserted into historic districts, buildings out of scale with their neighbors, poorly designed buildings with inappropriate materials and details, parking structures that look like stacked parking lots. Other features that detract from the beauty of a city: freeways and railroad lines, trash and dirty streets, garbage containers, power poles and transmission towers, overhead wires, surface parking lots, billboards, large signage and advertising of all kinds, vacant lots, graffiti, bad public art, and finally substandard night lighting. The first step in dealing with these negative features is to recognize that they degrade the city and are not good for business. The next step is to initiate actions to fix the problem or mitigate the impacts. Guidelines and standards. City character and livability are determined in large part by what happens at the street level. Consequently, the first priority in developing implementation rules should be the creation of design standards and guidelines that create pedestrian-friendly streets. Sidewalks bordered by blank walls, parking lots, empty forecourts, and driveways create an inhospitable environment and should not be allowed. Design guidelines are discretionary, not mandatory. Design standards are mandatory. Design guidelines. The role of the guidelines is to promote appropriate design and construction in a city's central core and neighborhood centers, and to discourage the construction of any new building that may have a disruptive effect on the appearance or functionality of the center. These guidelines are applicable to both privately and publicly owned parcels of land. They provide developers and architects with a clear understanding of a city's expectations for new construction. They also provide city officials a framework for reviewing proposed projects. Guidelines encourage everyone to play by the same rules. At a very minimum, design guidelines should provide information on community character, including unique historic features or other special architectural attributes that must be respected. Pedestrian needs, including techniques for creating pedestrian-friendly streets and spaces. Architectural requirements, including characteristics that maintain high-quality compatible development. Lighting, including concepts for illuminating buildings and streets to improve business opportunities and security. Signs, including functional and tasteful ways to identify commercial services and/or building tenants. Guidelines need to illustrate both what is acceptable and what is not. For example, contemporary buildings inserted into a historic district can erode the visual integrity of the district when they are not visually compatible with the adjacent historic structures and should be deemed unacceptable. Cities should be very clear about what is not acceptable in order to prevent the unacceptable design solutions from being submitted for approval. Incompatible building designs can have a significant impact on a city when a large number of incompatible buildings create visual chaos. The consequences will lead to the creation of a city center that is not attractive to the public or the investor. Cities that have unified design themes are cities that people like to visit. Santa Fe is a good example. Its design guidelines stipulate that only buildings in the Pueblo or territorial style will be approved. Unlike Santa Fe, however, many communities do not have design guidelines in place that prevent contemporary buildings from being insensitively inserted into the historic fabric of a city. Even a single out-of-character building is hard to tolerate, but a number of such buildings can significantly erode a downtown's unique visual character. Eventually, a downtown can lose its distinctiveness altogether, become a place people no longer want to visit or invest. Design guidelines are needed to keep architects from degrading cities. It is not uncommon for building owners or public agencies to ask for assistance in reining in architects who are set on selling designs that are inappropriate. A classic example was a proposed design for a 40-room guest house for a conference attendees at the Johnson Foundation International Educational Facility in Racine, Wisconsin, a campus which included the famous Frank Lloyd Wright House, Wingspread. Completed in 1939, Wingspread, a National Historic Landmark, is the last and largest of Wright's prairie-style homes. The proposed guest house would have been twice the size of Wingspread. I was asked to intervene. Sam Johnson and the Foundation President Boyd Gibbon asked me to review a preliminary site plan and design for the proposed building. The design had two major flaws. First, the proposed guest house was sited too close to Wingspread. Its large size would have diminished Wingspread's prominence, relegating it to the role of a secondary structure. Second, the overall design for the guest house was a caricature of Wingspread rather than a sensitive homage to Wright's majestic house. The foundation didn't want to mimic its famous landmark building, but it did want to have a respectful neighbor. The foundation decided to hire a new architect for the project, a talented Wisconsin firm, who assured the foundation that their building would be compatible with Wingspread. I was retained to represent the foundation and provide design oversight. When the preliminary concepts for the revised guest house were submitted for review, I was shocked. The design by the newly hired architects was completely unrelated to the character and quality of Wright's famous building. It was a tight-skinned, super slick, contemporary design that screamed out, "Look at me!" I rejected the design and gave the design team a summary of Wright's design fundamentals for their edification. A new designer from Wisconsin was assigned to the project. Using Wright's design vocabulary, he produced an acceptable design for the guest house, one that was horizontal in character with large overhangs. The new guest house, which sits comfortably on the site, is a good neighbor and plays a secondary role to Wingspread. The design of a carousel museum in Albany, Oregon provides another example of the challenges in designing a building that fits into a pre-existing context. In this case, a talented Oregon architect had been retained to design a building that was to house a carousel carved by a group of Albany artists and craftsmen. Albany had a wonderful stock of historic buildings downtown, and the Carousel Museum had been designated the anchor building at the end of the town's historic Main Street. I was retained by the city as a design consultant. The architect clearly understood the parameters of the project before accepting the job. Even so, in the first meeting with the client, he showed up with 3 design alternatives, all with slick contemporary character. The client, needless to say, was not happy. After weeks of wrangling, the architect resigned the commission. A more recent example of these kinds of compatibility challenges is a new city hall in downtown Whitefish, Montana. Whitefish is a popular destination for tourists who ski in the winter, tour Glacier National Park in summer. Its downtown is filled with many historic buildings. A Montana architect was selected after assuring city officials that their design for City Hall would be compatible with the historic downtown. Unfortunately, their preliminary design was more contemporary than historical, and the city was not pleased. After many unproductive negotiations with the architects, I was asked to provide design oversight on behalf of the city's interests. Whitefish officials understood that inserting a contemporary building into the downtown would erode its historic character and, in turn, the economy and investment environment. Ultimately, a final design was approved after the architect removed trendy contemporary features that were foreign to the town's character. I have many similar experiences with other architects who were not responsive to the pre-existing urban environment. It is essential for a city to take the initiative and adopt design guidelines and design review procedures that keep future construction from degrading its unique cityscape. Design Guideline Checklist. Design guidelines contain both written descriptions and photographs of acceptable and unacceptable building designs. Not every guideline may apply to a particular project. A one-page checklist is a helpful tool for summarizing the guidelines for a proposed project and for determining whether or not a project is in compliance. Building design standards. Building design standards ensure that all new development is in compliance with the intent of the framework plan. They identify the essential requirements for how a building relates to the public realm, such as sidewalks and streets. For example, design standards may prohibit blank walls at the street level or specify a percentage of the wall openings along the sidewalk. There are many design standards that can improve the downtown pedestrian experience and spur private investment. But none are more important than regulations that require buildings to be built to the sidewalk's edge, prohibit blank walls, and identify required retail areas. Responsibility for administering design standards can easily be allocated to city staff because design standards allow no room for interpretation. A project is either in compliance or it is not. Public area standards. Approximately 40% of a downtown's land areas is occupied by streets and sidewalks. These constitute the public realm. Public area standards identify design requirements for this realm and for open space, such as parks and plazas. Most communities do not have established standards for making the public realm both pedestrian and bicycle friendly. Most transportation engineers are primarily concerned with moving traffic through a city and providing adequate parking for cars. Pedestrian and bicycles can be an afterthought. As traffic volumes increase, streets are often widened to accommodate even greater amounts of traffic. Curbside parking is often removed and sidewalks narrowed to accommodate more lanes of traffic. The erosion of the pedestrian environment usually occurs gradually until the downtown is no longer a friendly place for pedestrians. Creating public area standards is a necessary step for making the streets pedestrian friendly once again and for preventing the pedestrian realm from being further degraded. Public area standards should address landscaping, lighting, and all modes of travel, walking, bicycles, public transit, trucks, and automobiles. Pedestrian standards. Pedestrian standards deal with sidewalks, crosswalks, lighting, landscaping, wayfinding, seating, trash receptacles, and newspaper racks. Bicycle standards. Bicycle standards include shared use pathways, separated or protected bike lanes, on-street bicycle lanes, bicycle parking, and intersection signals. Roadway standards. Roadway standards cover automobile and truck lanes, curbside parking, curb extensions at street corners, curb radii, and transit stops. Complete street standards. Public area standards should also include the design of complete streets in which pedestrians, the bicycle, public transit, and the automobile are all given consideration, but the pedestrian has a top priority. The allocation of available space is always a primary concern when trying to increase sidewalk width or add protected bike lanes. For example, if sufficient space is not available for protected bike lanes on streets with 3 or 4 lanes of traffic, it may be possible to take out a lane of traffic. In many cases, it turns out that the road can function nearly as well with 1 lane eliminated. Preparing complete street standards for existing streets can be difficult and often requires trade-offs. A typical trade-off was apparent in the creation of a protected bikeway on both sides of Higgins Avenue in Missoula, Montana, achieved by eliminating a single lane of traffic. In Lincoln, Nebraska, the trade-off was vacating a lane of traffic in order to provide the space necessary for a bidirectional protected bikeway. Trade-offs like this are part of a road diet because the elimination of a traffic lane slims down the roadway. In other cases, however, efforts to enhance the pedestrian environment are not as simple as a road diet. For example, in Whitefish, Montana, the task was to make the downtown retail street, Central Avenue, more pedestrian friendly. The 10-foot wide sidewalks were too narrow for comfortable shopping experience, and the intersection pedestrian crossing distances were too wide to feel safe. The complete street standards we developed for Whitefish included: widen the sidewalks by narrowing traffic lanes, narrowing the distance of pedestrian crossings at the intersections by extending the sidewalks into the parking zone through curb extensions, eliminating curbs at pedestrian crossings by raising the level of the intersection so that the pedestrian would not have to step off a curb to cross the street. The intent was to prepare complete street standards that would never be dated by fashionable design trends. As a result, all of Whitefish's improvements reflected an elegant simplicity, durability, and timelessness. Design review. A design review process is effective only if it is responsive to established design guidelines which reflect the community's values and aspirations for the built environment. The review process can help protect a city's unique identity and attractiveness to private investors. Design review without design guidelines can be arbitrary and ineffective, yielding biased choices from individuals serving on the design review committee or from members of the public who may be attending the design review sessions. The process can be cumbersome and complicated. The challenge is to make it efficient and effective. An independent committee, not comprised of city planning staff, should be established specifically for the purpose of design review. Its directive should be to evaluate all proposed large construction projects relative to their compliance with design guidelines. It is too much to expect city staff to handle the complexities of design review alone, for their job might be jeopardized if political pressures arise to approve or reject a particular project. Not every project needs to be subjected to a formal design review process. Most city administrators have on-staff capabilities to review small or minor projects quickly and efficiently.
Thanks for listening. Please like and subscribe to get updates for future chapters.